Hi, everybody. It's Miss Corbett here. It's nearly 3 o'clock on September 1st, Tuesday, September 1st. I can't believe it's already September. But I finished reviewing all the work in Module 2, and so you know that means it's time for our class notes video. This last week, we really dove into the Golden Age style. You learned a bit about it and kind of what the basic tenets of it are. And then you started reading The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, a very classic Golden Age text. Golden Age style is one of the biggest movements in styles of detective fiction of all time. It might be the most popular, most lasting, most influential. So much so that even today, we have contemporary writers who still work in a Golden Age style. So again, Golden Age is both the time period and the style. And this style has been so influential that even once the time period passes, the style still remains. So we always want to keep that distinction in mind. In addition to reading and doing the video quiz, we also had this time travel discussion board. In that, we spent some time considering the distinct differences we noticed between the events and customs within the book world, right? The time and setting, and then the world as we know it today. In reviewing your posts, which, were overall great, by the way, I'm really enjoying how thoughtful y'all are being with these readings. But I noticed a few patterns of things that kept coming up, the kind of stuff we saw as being big differences. There were a lot that related to technology, like the lack of cell phones or security cameras, the existence of payphones, the speed of the spread of information, how quickly something would get across social media, that kind of thing, how that might be different. And those differences, like many others, might seem on the surface to be kind of small. Either you have a payphone or you have a cell phone. But of course, it impacts so much about the world that people live in. Same with differences in the investigation process. A lot of people noted, there was a lack of crime scene technicians. They interviewed suspects altogether without taking notes. Everybody had access to the body, that kind of thing. There's two things I want us to note about those kinds of differences. One is to remember what we know about the attitude most Golden Age literature takes toward the police. They are not seen as very effective. Bumbling idiots is a term often used to describe them, right? They're overconfident, that kind of thing. So part of it is their sloppy detective work is part of the style, but also a lot of the things that we now consider standard operating procedure for crime scene investigators, and the stuff we see on TV mostly, because that's probably how most of us are aware of what they do in that job. A lot of those procedures and standards are things that, quite frankly, just weren't established or weren't applied consistently at this time period anywhere, right? There are things we do now. There are procedures that everybody follows, or, maybe it differs by state or region, but in that department, they're supposed to do X, Y, Z when they come to a crime scene. Well, that kind of consistent standardization of practice just probably wasn't in effect at this time. So you also then have, these are small town cops being brought into a murder case, which is a big deal. So it's both that they weren't going to be given a lot of respect, but then also that some of those things might just not have existed as procedure at the time. We also noticed some social facts like gender roles, attitudes towards women, social hierarchy like the butler and the maids, maybe more politeness or distance, detachment in their conversations. And then a number of us commented on the differences in medical treatment, such as pills being given without tests, doctors making house calls. A few people pointed out, though, that, it's interesting, all these things we think about as far as like house calls and the milkman and all that. It feels outdated, but then in a lot of ways, we're doing it again now, right? When you order Uber Eats and they bring you food, that is kind of like your modern day milkman. And if you have to see a doctor over telemedicine, that's not unlike house calls. So it's kind of interesting to see the cycles of these things, how we might have moved away from that and then perhaps maybe in some small ways moving back to it. There were some differences that maybe are more a case of relating to the genre than maybe period or culture. So, for instance, a lot of us noticed how they weren't very emotional over the death of Roger Ackroyd, and that's true. And some of that could have to do with the stiff upper lipness of British culture, this idea of being, proper and polite and all those things, dignity and decorum mattering, but also it's at least some part because that's the style, right? This type of detective literature wants you to focus on the puzzle. They don't want you to get distracted by the emotional depth of what this experience would be like. So they just don't spend that much time on it. I don't know that that means those people alive at that time in Britain would have been emotionless about death, though who knows? So the point of identifying these distinctions is to start paying more attention to how the structures and facts of a culture and time period influence what happens in a story. The same general events would play out differently if they were to happen today in our culture, in our, in the Atlanta area or in, other places we might be right now. So it's almost like we're detectives ourselves, looking for clues in the text to how these people might have lived. I encourage you as we keep reading to continue to notice these distinctions, considering both the overt and covert implications of them. And overt means the outward, easy to see, obvious ones, right? And then the covert, maybe the hidden or subtle implications of these differences. Think about how something as seemingly simple as the existence of payphones might affect not just the story, but the culture in different ways. If you have a phone with you all the time, and everybody else does too, well, that changes a lot about the way the culture would interact and about interpersonal relationships and about identity. Who are you when you're alone? That kind of thing. That changes. And also think about how these differences in culture and time period aren't always all good or all bad. Yes, we'd have more science involved in the investigation if it were happening now, but we might not have the same easy access to the suspects that Poirot and Shepard do. And if you did have police that were not as capable of doing the investigation, then if Poirot didn't have that kind of access to questioning people, he might not be able to investigate the mystery. Similarly, Ackroyd might have had security cameras everywhere if this happened today. Maybe even a security team, bodyguards, that kind of thing. So maybe that would have kept him alive, but living in such a setting has its drawbacks too, such as maybe a lack of privacy, a lack of freedom. Not to mention the anxiety that's implicit in needing and wanting those things. If you have to live in that constant state of fear and protection, that's not good for your mental health, right? That has implications to your emotional development as well. So it's not just good and bad. It's not, as we've mentioned before, the progression of societies over time, forgive the flub, they're not always linear, as in it's always just getting better or always just getting worse, right? There's pros and cons and wins and losses to every aspect of shifts in culture. Looking closely at the culture and historical aspects of another time and place, remember also that it doesn't just tell us about them. By learning about them, we also can learn more about ourselves. When we're studying the differences between that culture and ours, involved in that is us looking at our own culture that way. And that's a good eye to have for any kind of cultural analysis. One thing about discussion boards, just real quick, kind of a housekeeping thing. I had some people email this time wanting to use a hall pass because they missed the initial posting deadline. So the initial post didn't go up by Friday. You're always allowed to use a hall pass if you want to, but let me say a couple things about why that's probably not the best way to use it. One is, remember that you can look at the rubrics for how I'm grading discussion board postings, and you'll see that posting after the Friday deadline, but still within the module, you only lose a few points that way. So it's always better to post late than not at all. The second is that I think I would recommend you using hall passes for assignments that have already ended so that you could go back and do them, as opposed to ones where you still can get most of the points, just so you know you're hanging on to those opportunities for when you really need them. You don't want to waste one on something that's only going to be a few points and then need it for something bigger later on. All right. We did these reading journals as well, and I'm glad to see everybody's kind of jumping into the book. We're not necessarily all loving it, but I know we're kind of giving it a try, and I appreciate that. Many of us are loving it, but either way. So let's do real quick what's coming up in Module 3. So you'll do more reading, and yes, it's another big reading assignment. These weeks are the biggest reading assignment as far as reading a book that you will have over the course of the semester. But it is, I hope you've seen how the book can move pretty quickly. You're also going to watch a video on the elements of character, where we're talking about what we mean, what kinds of characters exist, how writers develop them, why and to what end. One thing to remember is that Golden Age literature, this style, isn't one that prioritizes character development that much. We might feel like we love Christie's characters in this novel, but they're not given much complexity, nor do we know much about their inner lives or their backstory, or, we don't see them being contradictory in any way or being developed in any way. So character development is not a big deal with Golden Age. They were much more focused on plot. But that gives us the opportunity to kind of start learning the basics of character so that then we know these terms and can apply them when we get to more complex characters later on. So you're going to do that introduction video. You're going to take a reading and video quiz. And then we do have another small group discussion board. And in this, you're going to pick a scene from this week's reading. So from these chapters, not from the ones we did last week, that you feel like does a good job of establishing and revealing a particular character's personality. And you're going to talk about why. Please note a couple things. As before, I really ask that you put certain information into your subject line. We did a good job of that overall, so that your group members can skim it and see who's taken what. So you name a chosen character and page numbers, and then that's off limits to somebody else. So the sooner you post, the more choices you have. You can use the same character in different page numbers, or use the same page numbers for a different character, but you can't do the same that's already been done. So make sure you're looking at all available postings before submitting your own, and that you say what you've selected in your subject line. And then again, as we will every week that we have a reading assignment, you're going to do a reading journal. As before, pick one of these prompts and just make sure you meet the word count. All right, I think that's it for now. I hope your September is starting off well. As always, let me know if you have any questions or if you just want to talk more. All right, see you in Module 3. Bye.